Well, good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us today, the intersection of faith and culture. This is the Meeting House on Faith Radio, and it is great to welcome back to the program the founder of Mama Bear Apologetics, Hillary Morgan Ferrer. Also, we have the co-host for the Mama Bear Apologetics podcast, Amy Davison, and they have co-written, they've been involved in a book called Mama Bear Apologetics Guide to Sexuality, empowering your kids to understand and live out God's design. Hillary and Amy, it is great to have the two of you on the program today. Welcome aboard from Idaho and Texas, respectively, Hillary and Amy.
Thank you so much for having us.
Well, it's great to have you back on the program. Let's talk. First of all, Hillary, you and I had the opportunity to talk several years ago about the overall ministry of Mama Bear Apologetics. I love the name. It's one that you cannot soon forget. So tell us just a bit about how this came to be.
So Mama Bear Apologetics was definitely, it started out as a series of sleepless nights where I just had this phrase Mama Bear going through my head. And sometimes, I don't know if you do this, if I can't sleep, I think if I could just get my thoughts on paper, maybe I'll be able to go to sleep. And so I just started writing a whole bunch of stuff. And it turned out it was like this whole ministry idea. So I just started talking to some of the ladies that were around me and saying, hey, I think we should do this. And so since then, it has just taken off. We've just grown slowly but surely. And within a year, we had a publisher asking for a book from us. And then that has gone extremely well. It's been very well received. And so we have a whole series of books in the lines now coming along the pike. And just we have noticed so many women that are just hungry for being able to equip their kids to understand why the Bible says what it says, and not just what it says, but to actually be able to defend it to themselves and to people around them who are questioning.
Well, the two of you have you've worked together on this book, and it's called Mama Bear Apologetics Guide to Sexuality. Amy, tell me just a bit about your involvement. How did you become part of the Mama Bear Apologetics empire?
Yeah, that just sort of happened by accident. I was finishing up my master's in Christian apologetics, and I had always been on the meeker side of being involved. And I just was like, God, I want to be bold. And so I had spent the whole year just in prayer of doing these sort of bold things for the Lord. And it was on New Year's Eve, the last day of the year, I was like, I've known about this ministry. I have a heart for this ministry myself, having 3 boys. Let me reach out and see if just they need anybody. And so I sent Hillary like a quick email being like, hey, I've got a love for apologetics. Here's where you can see some of my writing. If you need somebody, let me know. And I think, Hillary, it was like 20 minutes later, you wrote me back and you're like, oh my gosh, yes. Yeah. And so we ended up meeting face to face, I think that January, really hit it off personality wise. And it's just kind of, I don't want to say snowball, but it has, it's just taken off. And yeah, in a good way. Yes, definitely. And so we've been writing and podcasting together now for almost 2 years, and it's just been a great ministry.
So, Hillary, tell me about how the two of you really came together to compile this book.
So the funny story behind this book is I had the publisher pitched this book to me several times, and I said no. I was honestly a little nervous about writing on this topic because there's just so many ways that you can go wrong. And the final time they pitched me was March of last year, right when everything was blowing up, and I was thinking my husband could lose his job. And so I finally was like, okay, yes, we'll do this book. And I knew immediately that Amy was the only other person that I wanted to write this book with me, just because she'd done a lot of study in sexuality. She was a big Nancy Pearcey fan. And so we just kind of would talk about what do we want this to look like, what are the topics that we want to include, and just a lot of back and forth going on. We went on an epic writing retreat, I think in December, where I gained about 7 pounds from Cheez-Its. So yeah, I think she has a real strong basis. I'm more in the sciences and she's more in the humanities, and so she was bringing a lot of just context from pop culture, from what her kids were seeing, because I don't know, some listeners don't know, I don't have children, and so being able to watch the cartoons and know what's actually going on in the kids scene, that's actually not my forte. I'm better with the ideas. So I just find in so many ways Amy and I balance each other out. We have good back and forth. We were doing a Facebook Live for our launch team this week, and she and I were going, well, let me play devil's advocate. Well, I'm gonna play devil's advocate. And yeah, so she's just a joy to work with.
Hillary Morgan Ferrer, Amy Davison joining us today here on the Meeting House on Faith Radio, the co-authors of Mama Bear Apologetics Guide to Sexuality, empowering your kids to understand and live out God's design. Okay, so the last couple of words of the title of this book, or I should say the subtitle, God's Design. And that's actually a phrase I find myself saying on the air periodically, especially when we talk about some of these areas of sexuality that certainly do not conform to God's design. And unfortunately, there are multiple types that are out there, but we talk about God's design. So Amy's kind of set up the context for us as you wrote about God's plan, God's design for sexuality. What are some of the principles upon which that is based?
Well, one of the things we go through at the beginning of our book that Hillary writes so well on is how we see God's design, his ministry within the church, just mirrored within sexuality. And that's one of the things that is so interesting, especially when you look at culture, is culture, it's not just about wanting to get our kids to have sex and be sexually active. It's all about destroying that biblical worldview, warping appetites, and laying this false claim to identity. It's basically Romans 1:18 through 32, just played out in just all its brutality. And one of the things that's so great is in the introductory chapters is just laying out, okay, this is how God originally designed it. This is how we see his ministry within the church, even mirrored out with just the relationship between a man and a woman together in marriage. And it's beautiful, but it's so broken now that our world has sort of taken hold of this. And Hillary, I think you can even, since you wrote more on this, can even contribute here.
Yeah, just we go through not only sexuality as a picture of our relationship with Christ, but like we have all these different pictures that God gave us so that we could understand him better. And when we mess with the picture, we start to misrepresent God and misunderstand who God is. John Piper did a book back like 2005 called Sex and the Supremacy of Christ. And his thesis in there was that our sexuality and our ability to see God correctly are just absolutely intertwined. You can't mess with one without messing with the other. So it's this idea of there is a design there. It's there for a purpose. It's there to show us what God looks like, who he is. And if you look throughout the Old Testament, every single time you see the Israelites going into sexual sin, you see idolatry and idol worship and just absolute paganism right on the heels. And I think there's a reason for that, because they are misunderstanding who God is. And eventually they start worshiping that misunderstanding of God.
Hillary Morgan Ferrer, Amy Davison joining us from Mama Bear Apologetics. They've written the Mama Bear Apologetics Guide to Sexuality. And I understand, Amy, that the two of you contend that, well, the talk, specifically the talk with children about sex, has changed throughout the years. I would imagine that, unfortunately, you've got the cautionary aspect that is there, but also to be able to take the information and and even as Hillary was saying, the scientific research that's out there. There seems to be a lot more that could go into that. So tell us about how you cover that in the book.
Yeah. So, and it's one of those things, like, I think we all grew up with, having that one super awkward conversation with our parents about, what sex is. And maybe there were some awkward hand gestures that still we can't blank out of our minds, but that's never how sex was supposed to be. And I think it's really interesting, especially when you look at how, when the Israelites had come out of bondage, God had brought them at the base of Mount Horeb. And he said he wanted the Israelites to teach his precepts to his children so that they may not forget his teachings. And that word teach is really interesting because it's the word lemad, which means training with the implication to put into use. And we as a church and as a people have not taught and even thought about sexuality in that way. And yes, the sex talk has changed because kids are being groomed from a very young age to be sexually active. I mean, we see this, unfortunately, for girls most often in clothing and toys. I mean, the whole LOL surprise thing that blew up a few years ago was absolutely shocking. And parents were surprised that, oh, we have these toys and these clothing that are really sexually grooming our girls, but it's actually shouldn't be so unexpected to us because we don't live in a culture that adheres to the biblical worldview. So unfortunately, when the church is only starting to talk about sex in middle school and high school for maybe a teen retreat, they're actually at the tail end of this fight because the world has already been discipling our kids' sexuality from the time they're toddlers. I mean, if you've watched kids' cartoons lately, especially in June for Pride Month, we have Bubble Guppies having drag queens on Bubble Guppies and Blues Clues. I mean, and so all of this is starting from the time they're toddlers. And if we're just getting in the game at middle school, we're not just trying to teach to these kids. They already have a whole foundation that's already been built for them by the world. And now we're not only having to try and teach that, we have to break down that foundation. So it's like this constant game of catch up that we're playing. So yes, the sex talk has changed. It's not meant to be a talk. It's actually meant to be an aspect of our faith, because sexuality is an aspect of how we were designed and our faith. And so we need to be discipling our kids in that in the same way that we would theology.
And Amy, you make a very good point. And I would contend that when you're talking about apologetics, such as your group, Mama Bear Apologetics, you're really talking about the Christian worldview perspective, defending our faith and really applying the Christian worldview perspective to the issues we encounter in our lives. So very important when we're talking about matters of sexuality. Hillary, comment how you see that having the Christian worldview perspective really impacts a child's viewpoint toward sexuality.
Yeah, this is something that Amy and I talked about early on when we were working on the Worldview chapter, and that is how parents have a tendency to teach. How do you say, Amy? Teach a biblical world, teach from a biblical world, but not teach the biblical worldview.
Yeah, they teach from it, meaning it's already assumed, but they don't teach what it is. As in, okay, here's what a worldview explains. Here's how to recognize other people's worldview. It's more of a proactive approach.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you think of the Christian worldview as a bunch of puzzle pieces that all go together to make one singular picture, and all the different beliefs, all the different actions that we do are like these pieces to a puzzle, kids are just ending up with this pile of puzzle pieces and don't know what to do with them. And so it's showing them how sex affects the way we view God, and the way we view God affects the way it affects our sexuality, and it affects the way we view our bodies. It affects the way we view male and female. And all of these have been created together. It's like, the maleness and the femaleness, that itself is a reflection of God. It's a part of the Imago Dei. Let us make mankind in our image, in the image of God. He created them, male and female. He created them. And so teaching about, the little, I can't remember if it's the 2 cent or the $2 word, teleology, the idea that things were designed for a purpose. And so if we look at the body, it was designed for a purpose. And a lot of times you can find what something was designed for by how it was designed. In fact, biologists use this. They call it form follows function, that they can actually figure out what something is used for by the way it's constructed. And the body is the same way. And so learning how to really take in this idea that we are a mind-body unity, because right now we have divorced this idea of our mind and our body. It's this kind of nebulous idea of, oh, my mind is the real person and my body can be changed at a whim to fit my mind. No, there is a unity that's going on there, that if we don't understand that, think about it, Bob, what at the moment of death, what happens? What separates?
The soul or the spirit from the body.
Body from the soul, right? So that's the literal definition of death. What we are doing in practice is we are separating the body from the soul. And one of the things that I noticed, and I can't prove this, but the research that I saw on same-sex attraction with early sexual activity in teens, on transgenderism, and yes, all the way, nobody look this up if you don't know what it means, the BDSM community, with across the board, whenever you see sexuality deviating from God's design, it's usually an upwards of 40+% increased likelihood of suicide. And so I can't say this for a fact, but it seems like if we practice separating the body from the soul in how we act, and especially with regards to our sexuality, there is part of us that wants to complete that act. It's like it's almost like a living death that we're doing to our bodies and our souls. And so I think that's one way things have changed. But just seeing how all of this kind of comes together. And I hope we do a really good job in the book of describing the biblical worldview step by step. And then what does this have to do with sexuality, and seeing how it all comes together.
And tell me again, you said to go look something up. There was a term you used that I believe ended with
I said, don't look it up.
Yeah.
Oh, don't look it up. What was
yes,
it?
Don't look it up if you don't know what it means.
Oh, okay.
Or I guess I could. BDSM is just the people that like to hurt each other during.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, so.
All right. Very good. All right. I got a question. All right. So you're talking, Amy, about the talk with your children with respect to sexuality, and something that occurred to me, and please indulge me for just a second. I don't know if this is something that you cover in the book or to what extent, but it's something that's kind of been on my mind, and it's a bit concerning to me. There has been really a pushback over the last few years, it seems, in some evangelical circles about what was called, or what is termed, quote unquote, purity culture. And I guess the contention that some make is that, well, parents are teaching their kids, well, you don't do this, and sex is bad outside of marriage. And then you're having to completely change your viewpoint once one gets married, and then they adopt the viewpoint that this is good. However, for all of these years, they've been told this is bad, and it's somehow unfair to the person to make them go through such a dramatic shift. And I'm reading this kind of material, and I'm thinking there's just something not right about that.
Yeah.
I don't know how that strikes the two of you, but what do you think?
Yeah, no, and I've seen that. So with studying purity culture, I actually was fortunate enough to be able to look at the original curriculums, right? Because whenever you can have a great book, but depending on whose hands it falls into, it can be twisted and warped. I mean, gosh, we've seen that with scripture, right? So what happened within purity culture is there was an emphasis on changing action without changing worldview. And especially, we already mentioned Romans 1. All behavior, it starts from the worldview. Once your worldview shifts, actions follow. And that was kind of the problem with purity culture. It had this great idea of, okay, we need to sort of recover from the 60s and 70s and the sexual revolution that occurred, and how everybody just went a little crazy. And so they were trying to correct that. But instead of refocusing on what sex is supposed to be, it was, oh no, let's maybe use a little fear tactics in there. Let's go a little off the deep end. Let's try and stop actions without stopping the worldview. So a lot of these curriculums, while they praised God's design, the beauty of sexuality wasn't really emphasized. Instead, it was, oh, here's just the pitfalls of if you go astray. And it was almost these scare tactics. Unfortunately, girls, a lot of the burden fell on the girls to keep their brothers in Christ in line. It was, ladies, if the guy's looking at you wrong, it's because of your shirt. It's because of the length of your skirt. And guys kind of got this, not always, but kind of got this free pass. Like, guys, well, you just can't really help yourselves, and it was just this, it was a good design, or it was a good intention, but it just kind of fell flat. And again, it's because the emphasis wasn't there. In fact, there was one book that I read that it talked about how much brokenness there is in wayward sexuality, and then it didn't even get to redemption or how Christ can redeem till 17 pages later. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is awful. What if you have a child who's reading this and they drop out at page 5 and they have no idea how Christ can redeem and how he can fix things? And so that's kind of what happened with purity culture, is that there wasn't this emphasis on, oh, look at the beauty of God's design. This is how wonderful it is. This is how it should be cherished. Because when we see something as beautiful, we naturally want to cherish and protect it. That's why when you go to any museum and there's all these great displays and works of art, no one is allowed to go and put their hands all over them. They have these barriers in place because something that's beautiful and precious needs to be protected. So with purity culture, the problem was we didn't focus on the beauty of God's design, how we can honor it with our bodies, and how we can see it as an act of faith. Instead, it was just sort of these pharisaical line of rules of, oh, nope, don't do this, don't listen to that, don't go to dances, don't go to dark movies, that's going to lead to something. And so it became all these rules. It became like the law. And these kids were like, well, I can't meet all of these rules, so I might as well just have fun, as I'm failing. And so, yeah, that's kind of the problems that I saw with impurity culture.
Mm. And to a certain extent, Hillary, it sounds like that there was an attempt, and the pendulum swung in, in a certain direction. I would submit that now some of the things you read, it kind of is saying, well, that didn't work, so we need to. It almost sounds like that you're giving permission to be more permissive in, as far as practice of sexuality. I don't quite see the end game now of those that are pushing back, but I think you make a great point. It's actions without worldview. It's, Hillary, as you were saying, body without soul. Mm-hmm. And people are trying to govern their bodies, yet they don't have the right heart toward the subject, it sounds like.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the case. And if there were two things that I would say, like, I remember the moment that I read that book in Sex and the Supremacy of Christ, where it talked about our ability to see God and our sexuality. I remember temptation ceased to be temptation at that moment for me, because you can't say that for everyone. I valued my ability to see God correctly so much that I was like, whoa, okay, I don't want to mess that up. The second thing that came from a guy named Christopher West, who wrote a book called Our Bodies Tell God's Story, who actually goes through, so Pope John Paul II has like this 800-page thing on theology of the body. So Christopher West attempts to distill that down. But one of the things that he writes in there that we emphasize throughout the book over and over and over again, because I feel like if I had understood this as a teenager, things wouldn't have been as much of a struggle, is properly defining what sex is. And if we properly define it as a married couple restating their marital vows in bodily form. Throughout so much of the Old Testament, we see in covenantal theology, you have the promise that's stated and then an action that accompanies it. If you think of it, even now, we have contracts that have our names printed out, but it's null and void until we sign it. And so that sexuality is essentially what we have already said before family and friends and God, that promise that we made. That act of sex is signing our name on the dotted line to where that is now an enforceable covenant. And every time a married couple makes love, that is what they're doing. They're reiterating their marital vows in bodily form. And so if I had understood this concept, because it's like people who just say, oh, sex is making a promise. It's more than that. It's pointing back to a promise that was already made. Because people could rationalize, oh, if we have sex, then we're married in spirit. I've had friends that said this. And that's the idea of sex just being a promise. But if you call it what it is, referring back to a promise that was already made, sex before marriage doesn't make sense, because you can't refer back to a promise you already made if you haven't already made that promise. And so I would say, that's just kind of a side comment of two things that I really wish that people would understand about bringing this entire worldview together.
All right. So Amy, you get the last question here. Tell us, as far as some of the logistics with respect to parents teaching their children with respect to sexuality. Obviously, it's a worldview that can be taught and modeled to a certain extent. It's important. To me, it seems like that it's important to really begin to build that worldview inside the hearts and minds of children before they're really confronted. Of course, now it's, they're so young, it seems like. You mentioned Blue's Clues. I mean, that's a program that you start at 2 years old, and then, they're having drag queens on the screen, and you're seeing that. And there was that controversy about the gay men's chorus out of San Francisco saying we're coming for their children. They tried to pass that off as satire. No, it's not satire. That's what they're doing, is they're going after the very young. So it, in one sense, it becomes so important to really do this as an early age, recognizing the culture is actually presenting these ideas to children when they're very young. So there's really an element of proactivity that's incumbent upon Christian parents, isn't there?
Yeah, there really is. And that brings to point something that we parents can sometimes fall into, and that's just called the bubble. We want to keep the world out so
Hmm.
much that we put our kids in sort of this Christian bubble, which nowadays is so much easier than when Hillary and I were girls, because nowadays you've got not only homeschool co-ops, you've got private school, you've got Christian sports, cheerleading. You can pretty much put a Jesus stamp on anything. Heck, we even have Christian chicken and Chick-fil-A. So it's something to where it's so easy to fall into that trap of wanting to put kids in the bubble. And I totally get it. I actually was that mom at one point, but I realized that bubbles have the best of intentions with the worst of design flaws, is that they're easily popped. And what the world is showing is they don't think your kids are young enough for this information. So we need to be proactive about it. Now, for parents, one of the easiest ways to do that is by watching the cartoons with your kids. It's not like how it used to be. There is stuff that is so subtle and so quick and so attractive in these cartoons for little ones that if you're giving your kid your cell phone while you're shopping in the grocery store, they're going to be watching things and you're totally going to miss it. They're not, but you will. And one thing that I want to encourage parents is that kids actually do really well when we discuss these issues. There was a study done by ResearchGate that found that for Christian moms, and they had kids, if the moms who were the bubble moms, right, they kept all of this bad stuff away from their kids, they were militant in what they watched and what they listened to, and they never discussed these issues. So there's the bubble moms. Then you had the Christian moms who allowed their children to maybe watch some things where characters were making questionable decisions, but what they did is they paused it, or they talked after the show was over. Okay, was the person doing? What were their actions communicating? What would be a better way to handle it? They found that those kids were statistically less likely to make risky decision making than the bubble kids. And not only that, what's so encouraging is another study surveyed teens from 12 to 15, and they said, who's the biggest influence in your life regarding matters of sexuality? 54% of 12 to 15-year-olds said mom and dad. Not only that, 16 to 19-year-olds, 32% mom and dad. And that was against social media and friends. So between the ages of 12 to 19, which we are seeing the most brain growth happening at that time, the most sexual development growth at that time, we are seeing that parents have the most influence on their kids. And not only that, kids want their parents to talk to them. Yes, you're going to get the eye rolls. They may have the ear pods in at some point, but it's totally worth it because they're listening. They want to know. And when we are first in line to have those questions, they see parents not only as a source for truth, but as a safe space to wrestle with these, because there's situations that our kids are going through that we didn't, that's happening at school. And for the most part, kids typically go to friends first, but mom is number 2 on that list of who they go to for questions. And so what we want to do is lay that foundation of saying, if you can ask the question, I can give you the answer. It may be tailored to the appropriateness of your age level and, of course, location, right? I love kids, but sometimes my boys ask the greatest questions at the worst times. It's like, honey, the middle of Target is not a great space for this discussion. Let's wait till we get home or we're in the car. So we want to have that atmosphere of this is a safe doubting, a safe questioning home. If you want to ask it, I'll get you the resources. We'll discuss it. And you want to have that open door, that informational open door, because your kids, they're already going to be wondering this. Their friends are going to be talking about it. And if your kids have a cell phone, they're already watching it on TikTok. So you want to make sure that you can be a source for them to go to.
Well, I understand that research actually shows that kids ask the most awkward questions at Target or Walmart.
I think that is science. That sounds like science. Or it's got to be, or it's at family dinner, like Thanksgiving. I had a friend of mine at our former church to where it was dinner. They were serving lasagna, and she asked mom how babies were made right in the middle of dinner. And her mom's like, "Okay, let's do this." And she laid it all out there. And they have 8 children. They adopt foster care children, and like half of the kids started dying laughing. The others were like, "No, that's not how that works. That can't be it." And so it was just you got to be willing to roll with the punches and answer the questions, even when it's awkward.
Definitely made for a memorable Thanksgiving.
I know, right?
Well, the name of the book is Mama Bear: Apologetics Guide to Sexuality, Empowering Your Kids to Understand and Live Out God's Design. Hillary, tell us where people can get a copy of the book and find out more about your organization.
Yeah, so we are at mamabearapologetics.com, and I always like to tell people it's MAMA. I've gotten every single possible spelling of mama sent to me. So MAMA apologetics or bearapologetics.com. That's our website, and you can access our blogs. You can access our podcast on there. To get the book, it's basically wherever books are sold. The first book is now in Hobby Lobby. That was big.
All right.
Big to do. I'm really excited about that. Book 2, the Guide to Sexuality, it's on Amazon. It's in Barnes and Noble. I believe it's on Target.com and Christianbooks.com, one of our big supporters who have been awesome during this process. So you can get it in any of those places.
Well, you all make a wonderful team. Thank you so much for taking some time, and thank you for being so candid in your responses today. Great information. Hillary Morgan Ferrer, Amy Davison, thank you so much for spending some time with us today here on the Meeting House on Faith Radio.
Thank you so much, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.